All right. Hello and welcome back to the course. So now we're finally, after 2 videos, going to start looking into JavaScript. Now we've gotten Visual Studio Code installed, all the extensions, and all of the files for the project that we're working on have been installed. If you don't have all the project files, make sure you go to the last video and get them. So let's go ahead and get started by jumping right into JavaScript. So go ahead and make sure that you're in the app.js file, and let's do some JavaScript. So the first basic JavaScript that I can teach you is math. So obviously, 0 plus 1 is JavaScript. If we were to run this code by going to the index.html and clicking go live, you're not going to notice anything on this page at all. But if we click F12, this opens up our console. And I'm going to go ahead and refresh so we can get rid of that error, because sometimes there are errors that occur that have nothing to do with the JavaScript or the web page itself. It's just fetches. Now our console's empty. So we did 0 plus 1, and 0 plus 1 equals 1. What we're going to do is, how can we get this to the console? How can we see what 0 plus 1 is? How can we do that? So the best solution is, I'm going to go ahead and pin this right here just so you can see it better. The best solution is to go ahead and use what's called a function. So there's a function that we can call, and we do console. So this is how we access the console, is we type just lowercase console and then dot to access a specific method or a specific parameter. Well, not a parameter, but either to access a specific method or a property of console. So what do we want to do? We could do, now it might be, you might sometimes think it might be console.print or console.write. For this one, it's console.log. So we're logging it. We're logging what we want to do. And then at the end, because this is a function, functions require parentheses. Now, what does a parameter do? So, for example, if you had dog, let's say you had an object called dog. So a console is an object because this whole console is an object. Console has a function called log. Let's say that dog has a property. Let's look at the property that dog might have. Actually, let's look at a function the dog might have first. So what would the dog have? So the dog might have a function of bark. So it needs to bark. If you want it to bark, then that would be the function. It would return and do a couple things inside the function. So the point of the function is to call some other code somewhere else in a file or at a different point in your script file. Now property would be something like dog.age with no parentheses. It would just be just this. So that's the basics of that. I just wanted to explain that first before we get in. So now that we've gotten that done, what we want to do is just console.log 0 plus 1. Now, like I've said, if we just go ahead and save, in the last video, if you're using live server, it's going to automatically update, and now in console.log, it immediately runs this script, and we see 1 in the console. If we were, if you're not using live server, you're just opening the index.html, you just refresh, and it should be there. But I suggest you use live server because it's much easier. It's just more intuitive. So, but this statement isn't finished yet, because what we need to do is complete the syntax. Now, at the end of every single line in JavaScript, not necessarily every single line of code, but the end of every command, basically, you have to put a semicolon like that. It's right next to the enter key, next to the quotes. That's the key that you need to press. So if we did, let's say, console.log, and then we did dog. Oops, that is not dog. Okay, well, it's not gonna let me do dog, I guess now. Anyways, you get the idea. And you'll see more examples as we go on. So that's the basis of that. Now let's get into, that's basic math, but what are we going to do outside of basic math? How could we store a number? Well, in order to store a number, it's still like math. Math and programming are very similar. I mean, programming is based on math. So we're going to go ahead and declare what's called a variable. And in order to declare a variable in JavaScript, every programming language does it differently. We're just going to do var. It's just that simple, var. And then we can name it something. So we have to do var, we'll just say num. So this is, we'll just do actually my num. And then we'll set it equal to 1. And remember, the semicolon at the very end of the statement. So my num is equal to 1. Now what does this mean? This means that if I come down here and do console.log, and instead of doing 0 plus 1, I can now do 0 plus my num. And if I do that, we get 1 again. And as you can see over here, it says there's 2 numbers printing out. So it's 2 different console.log statements. How do you really tell the difference between them if they're the same value? Well, you can come over here and you can see that app.js :1. This is telling you the file name and then the position in code. So app.js and then line 1. And this one is app.js line 5. So line 5. So now we know where everything is coming from. All right. So that's the basis of that. Now, why would you ever want to store information in a variable? Well, if you wanted to store information in a variable, a great example would be, let's say you had a count of posts. Let's say that you had var post count is equal to 0, and every time you added a post, you did something like this. Post count equals post count plus 1. And that means that every time this code would run, post count would be equal to post count plus 1. You'd just be adding 1 to it. Now there's a shorter way to do this as well. Instead of doing that, you can do post count plus equals 1. And what plus equals mean is say post count plus post count. Oh no, post count equals post count plus 1. It's just basically plus equals 1 is just take what you have here, double it, and then add 1 to it. Add what's over here to it. That's basically what it is. And an even shorter way for what we're doing specifically of just adding 1. If you want to add just 1 to something every time the code runs, you can just do post count plus plus. That's what that is. Now later we will not be using that because we're going to be using what's called arrays to actually count the post count. So that'll be coming later. But let's go ahead and get rid of all this because we're not going to need it for the actual video. And let's go ahead and see what else we need to do. So the first thing we should probably do is let's understand what we need here. So the very basis of this is we have to get access to this text box, this button, because we need to know when someone clicks this button. So we need to add an event listener. We also need to come here to this text box and figure out when someone's, get the value from it when someone clicks this button. We also need to come down to this post and we need to be able to have access to the whole container of posts and be able to add posts dynamically. And fill in the data dynamically as well. And also later add an edit and delete button so we can delete posts and edit posts. So first, let's go ahead and make our posts data. So the best thing that we can do is what exactly is finding the best data type for posts. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to go through just about every data type that we can have, just so you know the basis of it. All right. So we're going to do what's called a num first. So there's num. It's a number. This is a number. It can be anything from 1 to 0.5 to negative 0.5. This is just any number you can have basically can go in here. That's the basis of numbers. Then we also have strings, and that's what's called a basically you can put text. So what you do is you put either single quotes or double quotes. It doesn't matter. In JavaScript, it's both. I prefer to do single quotes. And in here, you can start typing text. You can start doing like, this is my string. And you could put in characters. You could put in whatever. That's the basic of it. That is basically, that's a string. Now, the next one, I'm not going to be going through every data type because there's only a few that we need. The next one is a date. So var date equals new date. Now what this is going to do is it's going to create a new date based on the current date of your computer, locally, I believe. So it's going to create a new date that you can access. And later, when you want to access it, you can access things like date.now, or well, that's not this. Never mind. You can access new things from date, like getDate. And what does getDate do? GetDate gets the day of the month using local time. So it gets the day of the month from this specific date that we've made that was taken at this point in time. So you create a new date up here, and then you access the date of that date, not the current date. But the code's gonna run so fast that it will be the current date. All right. Then another one we want to do is, anything else we need is called object. So we're going to want an object, and we're going to set that equal to our first ever different type of variable declaration is this. So these are called curly braces, and we're going to use them a lot. And what I like to do is, well, actually that's fine. So you put in the curly braces, you press enter, and now we can start putting data in here. This is what's called an empty object currently because there's nothing in it. That's fine for running code, but later we're actually going to want to put data in here. So what we might put in here is something like, let's say an object might have, let's say we pretend this is a dog. So let's go back to the dog thing. So this is a dog. So the dog might have a property of age, and that's set to 1. It might also have a property of, let's see how many spots it has on its body. So spots, it has maybe 5. And then it might also have a property, like I've said. So it might have something like bark. And this is an example of a function I'm about to do. So function, so bark is declaring a new function because barking is a function. It's not a property. Barking can't be 5. It can't just be the string, like the text of bark. But if we go ahead and type function, this is a new one. This is a function. Function, and then declare parentheses, or what? Function, and declare parentheses, and then get out of those parentheses and do a open curly braces again. We can now do, maybe we could do console.log bark. So it's a function. So now if we access those, and we'll go ahead and access them in the console a bit later. We're just going to declare it all in here. So let's go ahead and look at arrays now. So var, and we'll just do R. This is how most people refer to arrays in code, is just ARR. Array is really just array. That's that. So var R equals, and then instead of curly braces, instead of like these, we're going to do these. These are called brackets, I believe. So in here, instead of being an object that can hold a bunch of different types of data, arrays are made for using unorganized data. So something like the first one could be like, let's say it'll hold a bunch of strings. So like, let's say you wanted for example, let's say you wanted an array of just text. So for your text post, you want an array of just your text. So you could do like, this is my first post. And then you do a comma to separate them. And then you keep going. This is my second one. Another thing to do is always to go ahead and enter it and keep everything on a separate line. It just makes it more organized depending on what you're doing. But you can also include multiple data. So we could actually include num in this. We could also include string. We could also include date. And we could also include bark. Well, dog.age if we wanted to. Or we could just include the entirety of dog. The entire object can also be in here. And you can actually have an array of just objects. You could have something like var my r2, or just we'll do r2, my bad, equals array. And a lot of times when you're handling a lot of data, like we might have an array. We have the great thing about an array, the benefit of it, is it allows you to have it's you should use it when you don't know how much data you're going to be handling when you are working on your application. So I can never tell how many posts that the user is going to have when we start our app. I can never tell. There's no way I'm going to ever be able to tell, because they can have as many as they want. If I put a limit like 5, then I could just have, like, let's say, you know, var post 1 equals blank, var post 2 equals blank, and it could be maybe an empty object. Well, instead of having just variables declared to objects, since we can include variables in here, what's the most logical thing to do? And since we have a limitless amount of posts that we can have, what we can do is have an array of objects like this, and you separate them with commas. And instead of naming each one, because we can't name each one, we just accept them. We just insert them right into an array. And then one more thing we're going to do really quick is we're going to talk about functions. So declaring a function in something like this is a bit different because there's a couple ways to declare a function. So first up, the easiest way is to just type function, and then we have to give it a name. So the name for this function is bark. It's basically, you can call it by doing dog.bark. But because it's a function, not a property, we have to do what? We have to put in parentheses and then a semicolon. That's going to call dog.bark. If we were to save this, bark, console.log bark on line 8, just as we predicted. But doing a function is a bit different when you're outside of a object. It's function space next. Now what? We gotta give it a name. That's what we gotta do. So I'm gonna give this a name of, let's see, my function. Good name, right? So my function, and instead of putting the parentheses down here, like next to function, we got to put them next to the name. And then we got to open the curly braces. And now we can do a bunch of different things. So in functions, one of the best things you could do is return something. So you might want to call a function, like, for example, how many, you might call a function, like a very good example of a function might be function square, and you would return, basically, you could give this function maybe like a number you wanted to square, and it would square it. So in the parentheses might seem useless right now, but in the parentheses here, this is where we can hand in data. So we might want to say, we'll say, okay, we want to look for a we want to look for our number, or just a certain number. So we're going to change this number to something else up here. I'm just going to change it to 2 for now. So we're taking in a variable called number, or num, and then we're just going to return num times num, because squaring is just the number times itself, and that's it. And then we're going to come down here, and we're just going to type square. We're going to say console.log, actually, and then in the parentheses of square, we're going to do, or in the parentheses of log, sorry, we're going to do square, call the function, and then hand in num. Now this is very similar too. Ignore the square right here. Console.log is another, like I said, it's a function. So this is the parameter that we're handing in. Console.log, if you just called console.log without any data, that's useless. It's just completely useless. But if we hand in square, we're handing in a function, and then a parameter, another parameter. So what it's going to do is it's going to call this function first. It's going to go ahead and evaluate it, then this function is going to return the value of num times num, so num squared, and then it's going to get the value of num times num. So for example, it's going to be 4, and it's going to immediately console.log it once all of the expressions have been evaluated. So this is an expression. If it was 4 plus 4, it's not going to console.log 4 plus 4. It's going to console.log the value of 4 plus 4. It would console.log 4 plus 4 if it was just like that, if it was in a string. It would just console.log 4 plus 4. But if we remove the string on that, and we just do 4 plus 4, it's 8. And then if we go back to square, and then put in num, we get 4, because 2 times 2 is 4. So that's the basis of functions and all the stuff. I know that it's a lot to take in at once, but I wanted to give you a basic understanding. Don't try not to remember all this, because you're not going to need to. I'm going to be guiding you through it. We're going to give you some challenges, but just keep in mind that there's a lot of stuff that we're going through, so don't get overwhelmed, and I'll see you in the next video.